It's a bizarre and wild situation to be in, and depressing. But it actually has to be sort of lone operators like ourselves, with little to lose, but with a passion for doing what is right, as we see it, that undertake this work, because we're not seeing the big media organizations prepared to risk their businesses to do it.
Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. If you haven't heard of the 1MDB scandal, then our conversation today may surprise you. Spelled with the numeral 1, letters MDB, it's the acronym for One Malaysian Development Berhad, which was at one time a Malaysian state investment fund. But billions of dollars from it went missing several years ago in what is now believed to be the world's largest money laundering scandal. $4.5 billion was stolen and funneled through the global financial system. Some of it ended up being spent on a litany of ostentatious items, including luxury homes in the United States, funding for A-list parties, and even a connection to financing a Hollywood film, The Wolf of Wall Street. Former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Najib Razak, was sentenced to 12 years in prison for corruption for his role in this crime. But a financier by the name of Low Tech Joe, aka Jolo, is currently a fugitive and on the Interpol red list. Our guest today, award-winning reporter Clare Rewcastle Brown, was actually issued an arrest warrant by Malaysia after breaking this story from her outlet Sarawak Report in 2015. Since then, the story has gained massive global attention, and a documentary is even in the works right now. On this podcast conversation, co-host Rachel Donald talks with Brown about her roots covering the extraction of Malaysia's forests, what led her to investigate the 1MDB scandal, the ongoing legal intimidation she faces, and the dangers that weaponizing the justice system can mean for press freedom and combating the multiple planetary crises we face.
Clare, thank you so much for joining me on the Mongabay newscast. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you. I'm a great fan of Mongabay, and I really just want to take an opportunity to thank you for the work you do.
Thank you. Now, the story of how you came to investigate 1MDB is almost as spectacular as the story itself. Could you give us a whistle-stop tour of how it was that you came to investigate Sarawak's forests?
Well, in a way, I was treading the same path as you folks at Mongabay. I was extremely concerned about the destruction of this vital, ancient rainforest that exists in Borneo that has been so underreported. Mongabay had raised the issue, and I was someone who'd been brought up as a small person in East Malaysia, which is a Sarawak suburb, the states of Borneo, the rainforest states of Borneo. And as a result, as a reporter, when I had some leisure, when I had an opportunity to go back as an adult, I felt this real burden of responsibility, like so many people who are concerned about environmental issues, to at least use my particular skill set to do what I was trained to do, which was to try and gain more awareness by writing about this as a journalist. This was just at the cusp of the internet explosion in that part of the world in 2008, 2009. And I realized that actually I could set up a professionally managed website. It would just actually be me writing the reports, but at least I would write them with a professional approach, looking at, reporting facts and making opinion pieces that were based on facts about what was going on. And so that's what I did. I just put my toe in the water to begin with and started writing about what was happening in Borneo and more to the point, basically calling out why it was happening. The reason why places like the Borneo rainforest and other beautiful, vital areas of the world are being ripped out, by, absolutely rampant resource extraction by a very few number of people is corruption. It's poor governance. It's greed, and the abuse of power on a massive scale. And everyone else loses out effectively. We as consumers have, of course, paid money for the transient goods that have been easily ripped out of the jungles and then sold to us. But this should never have been done in this way. Sustainable management of the forests was always available, to governments that cared about the public interest in their countries. And so I started writing about the massive corruption, the massive abuse of power, and the extraordinary wealth of the handful of people who had been destroying Borneo. And that eventually led me not just to the local despot who ran the state and is still the governor there, and all his crony timber tycoons.
The man that Brown is referring to here is Abdul Taib Mahmood, and he is currently the governor of Sarawak. Previously, he was the chief minister of the state for 33 years, between 1981 and 2014. His family is frequently accused of massively profiting off of public contracts and natural resources through a number of corruption schemes. Kayamata Sarawak, which is a publicly listed infrastructure company run by his family, received over $1.4 billion in state contracts over a 20-year period, according to reports. In 2011, Taib previously claimed that over 70% of Sarawak's forests were intact, but his claim was debunked mere hours later when Google Earth images sharply contradicted his statements. Reportedly, some groups suggest as much as 90% of Sarawak's primary forest cover has been logged. He was also accused by a Swiss-based NGO Bruno Manser Fund of attaining and holding a secret Swiss bank account, with funds gained through ties to logging and palm oil companies, which Taib denied. He did not deny, however, that his family had billions of dollars in assets in the British Virgin Islands, Jersey, Monaco, Germany, Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, or the UK, when asked.
But it drew my attention to the Prime Minister of that country at the time, who was basically facilitating this because it suited him politically and because he was ripping off his country in other ways. And by looking and following the story, I started to identify this massive scandal that involved the Malaysian Prime Minister, who was basically blatantly putting his hand into the public coffers and ripping off billions. That was the 1MDB scandal, it came to be known.
Now, this is the biggest financial corruption scandal in the history of the world, and yet not very many people know about it, perhaps because the locus is Malaysia. Yet this is a global story with global repercussions. I mean, you exposed a network of corrupt elite around the world who were benefiting from this money, with some of it ending up in Hollywood, in charity fundraisers, and even celebrity homes.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I was often criticized in some parties for sticking my Western nose into Borneo, which is actually just where I happened to have been born. So I did care about it, and I felt I had some locus. But I was accused of being a nosy foreigner. But in fact, this was a story that affects us all, that involves us all, in which we are all, to an extent, complicit across the world. This is a global problem, globally facilitated, and from which we will all suffer in the long run, thanks to the appalling consequences of climate change and the disappearance of our natural world. And so I covered this as a global story as a journalist, with from a different part of the world where this was happening. And to make the point, billions were being extracted both from the East Malaysian Borneo states and, as I was to discover, via Najib Razak, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and his cronies. Billions were being extracted into the global finance system managed primarily by countries like Britain and America. These billions were being spirited offshore, concealed by international banks, and then channeled into our first world economies, buying up property, pushing up property prices in places like London and New York, and indeed buying, fancy mansions and jets and yachts, the whole caboodle, in Europe, Britain, and America. And in a way, this gave me a handle on it, because once I started following this money and realizing that it was all being laundered through Western companies into Western markets and properties and assets in the dollar currency. Well, that gave me, a global locus, and it also involved other international regulators and investigators because it became their problem too, you see. And of course, the fact that, the perpetrators, and there was this rather flamboyant guy called Joe Low, a Chinese Malaysian, who was a young guy who'd been to Harrow School. So he was thoroughly, anglicized and Americanized, because he then went to Wharton and hung out in America most of his time. This guy was spending the money on behalf of Najib and on behalf of himself by the 100 million in places like Hollywood. And of course, for me, that gave me a great hook because everyone's interested in finding out that, superstars like Leo DiCaprio have been being given Picassos by a money laundering kleptocrat from Malaysia, which is what was going on. Miranda Kerr, Paris Hilton, Alicia Keys, many others, Britney Spears. They were all taking huge sums of money and massive gifts and having a brilliant party time thanks to all this stolen money. So it took me a while, but it was quite a story to follow.
I think it's good to mention here that I cut my teeth in this industry working for you. And one of the first tip-offs you gave me was about Leonardo DiCaprio's involvement. And I went digging through the Department of Justice documents with the court case. And I found that his name disappeared from one year to the next without explanation. There were a lot of powerful actors involved who washed this stolen money.
Yes, well, I've had to say it to people's face on numerous occasions, to really powerful and celebrated people's faces. You're getting involved in something you shouldn't. You're taking money you oughtn't. And I use the internet actually to troll Leo DiCaprio via Twitter and other such methods to say exactly that. And of course, he took no notice of me whatsoever to begin with. But he had every reason to know that there were concerns about Joe Low. Yet he held on and went partying and gambling with him on Joe Low's tab for months and years after we started raising the alarm about his high-rolling, high-spending friend. I mean, eventually, the FBI had to go and bang on Leo DiCaprio's personal front door and say, are you going to give back the Picasso that Joe Low gave you with stolen money, or are we going to have to arrest you and take it? At which point he finally surrendered this Picasso. That's what my understanding is anyway.
According to The Hollywood Reporter, DiCaprio's relationship with Joe Low began in 2010 after the two met in a nightclub. In 2018, DiCaprio was interviewed by the FBI and handed back gifts that were given to him by Low, and he claimed that he wasn't aware of where Low's wealth came from, nor was he involved in assessing or vetting philanthropic or business partnerships, and that was the responsibility of his team. Reportedly, DiCaprio did not thoroughly read the background check that his publicist contracted on Low. More details from previously undisclosed documents from the FBI were published in Bloomberg Businessweek in March of 2023. Which included interrogations with other celebrities such as Kim Kardashian.
But, these were the same with Miranda Kerr. Finally, she gave up, I think it was $8 million worth of fancy pink diamond necklaces, earrings, and matching whatsits that Joe Low had given her when he took her on a romantic Valentine's tour of the Bahamas in his new £250,000 super yacht. All of that stolen from the Malaysian development fund that they were ripping off.
Some context here. Kerr briefly dated Low, who gifted her this jewelry in 2014. As stated, Kerr later returned it to authorities. It totaled $8.1 million.
These Hollywood celebrities, when they say that they're, doing good for the public interest and great crusaders of the environment, someone has to call them out. And I've been someone who's had to do that. It's caused me a lot of problems in many cases, I can tell you, because all these people have a lot of money and very big egos and often very strong influence in various quarters. So, my life has been one legal case to the other ever since I I exposed this story, despite the fact that it's been true and everything I've written has been borne out.
Yeah. I suppose we should bring up your most recent case, as you got some bad news today. Can you speak to the libel case that you're currently battling?
Well, yes. I mean, I'm phlegmatic about it, if you're going to be sued by someone, it might as well be a queen, I suppose. Although in most countries, of course, queens do tend to rise above such activities, but not in Malaysia. So I've been sued by the former Malaysian queen, actually. They rotate their royalty. On something that is not in any sort of objective case, visible as being defamatory, actually. I'd mistakenly said that she'd been the member of her royal family that had brought the introduction of the said Joe Low, who then later became, got involved in 1MDB to her husband, who was the king at the time. In fact, it was the husband's sister who had made the introduction. But I'd said no more than that. I said I didn't give the names of either women. It was really just pretty, tangential, really. It was just a way of explaining how Joe Low had managed to get himself into these higher circles. But anyway, she didn't like her name having been in the book. I removed it very early on and replaced it with sister, which I don't think can be contested. I mean, it's public record that the sister was cited by Joe Low as having introduced him to her brother, who was the king. But, this has been used to come after me for years. She wanted 300 million ringgit. That's $100 million that I was supposed to pay her charities. When it first got to the High Court in Malaysia, it was dismissed as all the lawyers who had looked at this case in Britain said it ought to be, because the judge said there was no libel against her. I didn't say anything defamatory or anything that anyone would sort of remark, really. But she didn't like her name, her name being in there, and the fact that I'd mistaken her in the first edition, the first small edition of my book for her sister-in-law. And she took it to appeal. And overnight last night, sure enough, the appeal court in Malaysia overturned the acquittal and found in her favour, and is now demanding that I pay her a much lesser sum, but it's still, it's still more than I would ever have money to give her. So now I'm having to appeal to the final court. And, this is where I'm concerned that journalists who, I think it's fair enough, I think I have been now vindicated in having done a public interest job for Malaysia. This information was proven. The Prime Minister concerned at the time was voted out of office, is now in jail, thanks to the exposures that I made. And yet here I am facing prolonged legal harassment over these issues, these side issues, by people who have a great deal of power, who were tangentially caught up in this whole affair. So any journalist who does the work I do knows exactly what I mean when I say that, particularly Britain's libel laws and as they are inherited, even worse by countries like Malaysia, who use our justice system, part of the Commonwealth. They're designed to stop journalists performing their role in the public interest by holding the rich and powerful to account. And nearly every investigative journalist I know gets hobbled very quickly by people who have money and influence. I would say abusing the libel system to silence journalists and prevent them and frighten them, to destroy them, and frighten large media organizations who simply can't have, dozens of these cases going on at the same time. So large media organizations have started avoiding performing their most important role, which is to hold to account the super wealthy, the powerful, and particularly the criminally corrupt. They don't want to do it because they know that it'll lose them money, whether they're right or wrong.
I think it's really quite rare to find this kind of big picture reporting. Often the climate crisis is reported on as if it's distinct from politics or from economics. And when these things are mentioned, it's often in relation to the global north or capitalism or globalization. Yet to me, it seems like power and corruption created this polycrisis that we now face. The water crisis, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the inequality crisis. Do you think that's fair to say?
Yes, I think it's a very, very astute judgment. This is about our sliding democracies. This is about growing inequality, the growing disparity of power between the super rich and, anyone who isn't super rich, actually, but that's all the rest of us. And I think we're slightly sleepwalking into this situation. We've become complacent. We think we have rights. But we're not standing up to protect them as vigorously as we need to. And when you have our entire media becoming intimidated by a few powerful men, then, we're in danger. And this is happening not only in countries where you expect to see thuggish, centralized, power under autocrats who have arbitrary powers. We're seeing symptoms of this in Britain and America and Europe. I don't have to spell out some of the populists who are really now beginning to unleash anti-democratic forces against our judiciary and our media. Democracies are fragile flowers, and we need to be very, very aware of the threat to our democracies that this whole climate crisis exemplifies. 90% of the people I know, or can I revise that? I would say 98% of the people I know would be willing to make considerable sacrifices, as they did during COVID, to be socially responsible and restrain themselves in terms of how they live their daily lives to try and sustain the planet in a better way. 98%, or should I make that 99, or should I make that 99.095? It's a handful of people who are militating against that, who are refusing to allow the measures that we all can understand we need to take to improve our conservation of the planet. It's a handful of people who want to be able to keep their wealthy control over everybody else that are preventing the measures that need to be taken from being taken. The rest of us would share, we'd muck in, just as we always have when that kind of social spirit is needed. And it's galling that, that huge majority of people are being stymied from doing the right thing.
We have statistics on this. The richest 10% in the world cause 50% of the emissions. Millionaires are going to use up 70% of the carbon budget by 2030. This is a class problem, or rather a problem of the super rich versus, and it feels like versus, everyone else. And this is happening everywhere. Even in the UK, the law is being twisted to jail activists who are sounding the alarm. And I think that's what's extraordinary about your story. You've proven that it is possible to go up against all the odds, to do the right thing and succeed. You took on national governments and powerful industries to expose their wrongdoing pretty much single-handedly and really helped the Malaysian people. It's incredible.
Well, thank you, Rachel. And yes, you lived through some of it with me when you were part of the team. It's a bizarre and wild situation to be in, and depressing. But it actually has to be sort of lone operators like ourselves, with little to lose, but with a passion for doing what is right, as we see it. That undertake this work, because we're not seeing the big media organizations prepared to risk their businesses to do it. So, for a long period of time, I was covering this story when mainstream media would not, even though I had the evidence and the proof. And the mainstream media really only piled in after, thank God, I managed in a rare instance to get the regulators, i.e. the Department of Justice in the United States and the FBI, to actually take up this particular investigation. I mean, I'm under no illusions that there are massive thefts that occur all over the world, similar to what happened here. And they're not being investigated. Once the people who are in a position to investigate got onto this, everything I'd been writing about was soon vindicated, because banks had to produce their information that people like me can't get hold of. And indeed, offshore entities were then arm twisted also into providing the information that was needed. So yes, I mean, I went through hell, and I guess, it's interesting. First of all, I exposed the corruption in Sarawak, the East Malaysian state, with my original reporting starting back in 2009. Since then, I'm not allowed, I've been barred from entering Sarawak. And now, thanks to exposing the world's biggest theft, to enabling the population to overthrow effectively through being informed a highly corrupt government, and providing the evidence that enabled the courts to imprison the Prime Minister for grand kleptocracy. Thanks to that, I can't go back to Malaysia either now, because there are so many cases being brought against me by rich and powerful people, despite the fact that I've been vindicated, and even extending to so-called criminal libel. So it's not just civil libel in this one weird case, but they're trying to. They've issued red notice Interpol alerts against me over the same non-existent libel case, in order basically to try and keep me out of the country, and to threaten my ability to travel out of the United Kingdom. Interpol has twice, rejected those sorts of terrorist alerts against me. But I'm not a lone journalist in experiencing this level of harassment. It's what these sorts of people are able to do by abusing their authority within their independent countries. And those, that those countries' role within the international enforcement systems, which they also abuse. It's a well-known problem. I think what really upsets me is the way professionals in our own societies, in our own economies, are making so much money out of facilitating this kind of kleptocracy in ill-governed, badly developed countries. Where the rule of law is known to be lacking. These huge sums of money were facilitated through the financial systems by rogue bankers, and numerous banks were involved who somehow managed to turn a blind eye, by an army of lawyers who protected and litigated against people who criticize. Accountants, offshore entities, incorporation agents, businessmen, investment advisors, wealth management teams. There are armies of professionals making nice, but not huge sums of money in our economies, who are making it possible for this massive corruption to take place, and who are basically going after me. I mean, there are professionals within the media world who have spied on me, who have written about me, who've exercised black PR campaigns against me, trying to discredit and defame me, ex-police force people, ex-army people, all sorts of people who we would expect to uphold our democratic way of life and the rule of law, who have thought not once about prostituting their expertise in such a way.
Of course, we're coming off the back of another COP, and it really raises questions about the effectiveness of such negotiations and conferences if the incentives of the global political and economic system are so perverse and yet reward so greatly.
Well, it can be very exhausting and depressing. Having said that, and things are very bad at the moment. I think we're having a wave of anger politics, of people getting excited by, extremist populism. And I very much hope, and this is a historical thing, we haven't had a war for 100 years, and there seems to be some kind of crowd crowd need for some kind of aggressive showdown of some kind, if not against other countries within our own countries. I mean, that it is a sort of phenomenon. And I very much hope that we the voice of reason and truth will nonetheless prevail, and we will step back from this state of mind and remember how self-discipline is so important within society, that that conduct and the way that we debate our politics is vital to being able to keep a democratic process as opposed to one where the fist wins. And so it's absolutely important for all of us who think about these things and care and understand to just keep with a voice of reason, voice of truth, voice of moderation, understanding, keep articulating these problems and reminding everyone how important it is that we all pull together to ensure that, our natural instincts don't end up destroying the planet that we rely on.
Clare, thank you so much for your time today and for your work.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel, and for your work.
So first off, this is a really great conversation. And again, I feel like you're just nailing it, Rachel. Like, I feel like you're covering the subjects that often when people who talk to me about environmental destruction, they talk about, what's like the biggest thing you would like people to know about environmental destruction, is that I try to emphasize to people that many times it's a global economic and political story. Deforestation happening in a region which could be thousands of miles away from you is still very much something that impacts you in a certain way. So whether that's through a product you're buying in a store, or sometimes benefiting wealthy people in the country or state or city you live in. And I feel like a lot of people are missing this fact. They're missing this aspect, and the corruption that funds this is something that I think that it goes missed a lot, and it's not talked about a lot in mainstream media outlets. And so it was really great to hear you both unpack this and talk about it in such a clear manner. And of course, obviously, Clare has many times bravely shined a light on this over the past 7-8 years plus. So I thought that this was a really fascinating, very important discussion.
Oh, thank you, Mike. Clare's amazing, isn't she? I mean, the work that she has done, she essentially uncovered the largest financial corruption scandal in the history of the world by herself with probably what constituted a blog, certainly when she started out. And that's because she understood exactly what you were saying, the framing that we have a global financial system. And so the corruption that drives it is also going to be global. There is an elite network of people that can manage their money and have connections to politics in certain way that are going to ensure that they get the results that they want, often at the detriment of others. There is no other way to explain some people having billions in personal wealth and other people having nothing, not especially in a place like Malaysia. Actually, that goes for anywhere. But in Malaysia, the disparity is shocking. I mean, you've got indigenous people who are environmental defenders who are getting murdered by loggers or disappeared by loggers and having their lands taken away from them, having their means of survival taken away from them, having their culture taken away from them by this logging. And at the same time, you have families living in like palaces of gold and rubbing shoulders with, other businessmen at Davos and having the autonomy to absolutely destroy the biodiversity, the culture, the habitats of the fellow species with little to no repercussions. And that is why it's a global story, because now what we're seeing is essentially the actions of those people all around the world destroying at a rate of knots in order to transform natural resources that belong to everybody and also that we belong to, transforming that into personal wealth. We are now all seeing the repercussions of that as that is impacting our waterways, our biodiversity, and the climate crisis, which is sort of the biggest thing that people know about. And so we're all living with that rapacious greed, essentially, and with the impacts of it.
Yeah. And it's worth emphasizing here that this fund was a state development fund. And so all this money, $4.5 billion, was intended for Malaysian taxpayers. It was supposed to go towards developing public infrastructure and things of that nature for the Malaysian people. And what ended up happening is now that Malaysian taxpayers are on the hook for all that money that was stolen and the interest, which is more than twice the amount, I believe a couple billion that still has left to be paid. And so that's quite a tragedy in and of itself, separate from the fact that Malaysia's forests are being extracted at the pace that they are. Another thing that I think is that your conversation highlights is that if corrupt wealthy individuals or government officials or corporations are not being held accountable, the situation effectively doesn't change. This doesn't mean that things like boycotting products doesn't send a message or doesn't help, but ultimately, if the people responsible for that corruption or that extraction receive no consequences, then nothing truly changes. I believe the former Prime Minister Najib Razak himself is lobbying for a pardon. He's like right now lobbying for a royal pardon. And so if he gets that from his 12-year prison sentence, if he gets that pardon, then, where is the accountability? What stops another official from doing this again? And it's not the only instance of this in the world that I could talk about. There's no exact carbon copy instance, of course, but there's plenty of instances of corrupt officials trying to seek pardons for indictments or crimes that they've committed. And so I look at this and I think, wow, I just don't know what else would be able to hold a person accountable other than consequences.
Yeah, there's a lot I want to say on that. I think, first of all, for me, starting out my career, working on this story alongside Clare, it was a phenomenal introduction into how the world really works. Because Malaysia as a state is, in its current form, is really young. The colonialists only left like 60 years ago. And so the exploitation, the extraction, all of these things that we see, they kind of happen out in daylight. They're not hidden beneath like hundreds of years or thousands of years of relationships and family networks and legal structures and all this kind of stuff. So it was a wonderful example, essentially, of like, this is what goes on, and it's in broad daylight, so it's undeniable. And the extent of that corruption happened, it happened everywhere, amongst pretty much all of the royal families, all of the business elite, pretty much all of the politicians. It was shocking. And that's why I find it very frustrating when we deal with corruption as a story around the world and people seem outraged. I find it so frustrating because that outrage masks the reality, which is that this is a daily occurrence. The world is run on power and corruption and corrupted power, essentially. And so outrage essentially hobbles our capacity to hold certain people accountable because we treat them as examples that are anomalous, essentially. We treat them as anomalous examples in an otherwise perfectly functioning system rather than having the systems in place to deliberately weed out, catch, entrap, and force those people into very, very, very long prison sentences that are going to then deter others from doing it. But it's almost an impossible thing to do because the corruption spreads so far that, exactly in the example that you're giving, Najib Razak, he went to prison, but now he's lobbying for a royal pardon, which he may well get. Or, we can look closer to home in the United States and how Donald Trump has been treated or otherwise by, the media and by fellow politicians with regards to his outrageous and illegal behavior. So I think that this question of accountability is really revealed in our attitude towards these stories. And the longer that we keep pretending that they are one-offs, the longer that it's going to take for us to really put in processes that stop this kind of heinous criminality from continuing.
And there's another layer to this that Clare talked about at length, is her own legal tribulations that she faced, the reprisals that she faced in this situation. Being, I believe, Malaysia attempted to put her on the Interpol red list twice, and she was issued an arrest warrant. She can't re-enter the country. So I don't think it's an exaggeration when she says that democracies are fragile flowers, because they are. They require rigorous and ongoing action to defend. Otherwise, you continue to see the erosion of human rights and press freedom. And just like as you explained, I could talk about examples that are this is not anomalous. I could talk about many examples, but I think, but regardless, I think the point Clare is making is pretty clear in saying that a lot of people seem to sort of be sleepwalking into this situation where there's a lot of people that aren't aware of just how much this happens, of just how much not only the corruption aspect is happening, but then the silencing of the journalism around it. And I thought that was a really good discussion about that.
Yeah. I have to say, I disagree with Clare on this bit of democracy being fragile flowers, because I don't think that we do actually live in democratic states in the majority of the world. And I think that if we lived in states that were essentially at their very core democracy, then we wouldn't risk this kind of corruption, because there would be processes in place that stop individuals of such greed and hunger for power. Well, they wouldn't get to the top, essentially. And also this idea of sleepwalking towards catastrophe. I mean, I get it, and in many ways I do agree, but I also think that this period, this golden age of democracy and progressive values that we think about post-World War II in the West, when, tax rates went up and the welfare states were created essentially, and people's quality of living went up. That was also happening concurrently to a huge amount of exploitation and corruption that was going on in colonial states. So essentially, we were just extracting from elsewhere rather than from our own people. We offshored the corruption during that period. So I'm not sure if we have a good example yet of, these massive centralized states functioning well, because I think they've come out of a long, long history of inequality, essentially. They've come out of feudal royal states. Some of them are still feudal and royal, which is how, you get this these atrocious laws, for example, in Malaysia, that you're not allowed to criticize the royal family. Which means that, for example, they could step in and pardon Najib, and then nothing will be said about that in the press because of that law, which is really, really frightening. I don't think people do realize how much journalists hold the guardrails of society. And I understand equally their frustration with a lot of journalism, because when there's this amount of corruption going on, and when there's this amount of catastrophe and horror and exploitation and extraction, and when most of the press are not reporting on these stories, I completely understand why people are frustrated with it as an industry, and why a lot of people believe, myself included, that media is relatively complicit as well in the maintenance of this exploitative system. However, it's still something that needs to be reformed, not destroyed, because we need it more than ever.
Right. I mean, you make great points there, and I think I agree with your notion that in many cases we don't actually live in democracies. I would argue many times we actually live in oligarchies. But her point, which I do agree with, is that it does require effort to either defend or create those democracies. It requires constant fighting to maintain it.
Totally.
But yes, I agree with you. We could argue that we're not living in them. And a lot of multinational corporations are really pulling the levers about what occurs. To your point, Rachel, I have a report from Grist, another Grist shout out here. They reported just before COP28 that 4 in 5 people around the world support, quote, whatever it takes to limit climate change. So that was just before COP28 was getting started. So that's effectively almost 80% of people were in this survey that was done by Potential Energy at Yale program on climate change communication, saying that they support whatever it takes to limit climate change. So you would think, right? You would think 4 in 5 people, well, then we're probably all going to take action, right? But no, the people in power don't match up with the political will of the populace, at least in this survey. And that's a really frustrating dynamic. And I think also highlights the point that you were getting at there.
George Monbiot says that we are a society of altruists governed by psychopaths. And I really love that as a line. I think it's quite revealing of where we are. And I think that, the results of that poll versus the results of COP28, I'm laughing because I could be crying instead, really also revealed that. I think, though, I'd like to see who they polled. 45 people around the world. That's amazing. I think also the other thing that's quite frightening about that poll is like, whatever it takes. Like, what does that mean? Does that mean, eco-fascism or like eco-authoritarianism or, having our rights stripped away? I think even that as a notion is like quite frightening. We need to have an urgent response to the poly crisis because it's an urgent time. However, we must not have a dramatic response. We need to be pulling back and slowing down, not racing towards, political regime change, which is quite frankly what that sounds to me. That sounds like to me in that polling question. And I think this is the other thing that we need to be aware of is that there are totalitarian regimes around the world or authoritarian regimes masked as democracies that are going to use the climate crisis as an excuse to grab onto power and to shut down borders and to take back, the control of national wealth funds and, the free market and all of these kinds of things. And they're going to do it in the name of fighting the climate crisis. But we know very well it will just be another attempt to shore up personal, political and financial power.
Well, this was a dense one. I could keep going on about this topic, but I would like people to read more about it. We publish a lot of stories in Mongabay about the 1MDB scandal, and I've linked them in the show notes. And also, I recommend you check out Sarawak Report. They publish material, obviously, on this situation and others as related to Malaysia, and that is also in the show notes as well. Another interesting discussion, Rachel. Well done.
Thank you so much, Frank. And thanks for this. It's always interesting to speak to you at the end as well.
All right. I'll see you next time.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about any of the aforementioned stories, please see the links listed in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay newscast or any of our podcast content, like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is still the best way to help expand our reach. But, as always, you can support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a nonprofit news outlet. Even just $1 per month does make a difference and helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media. Find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thanks as always for listening.